So I'll whiz through it and see where we get to. The first thing I want to share is just a definition of poverty and child poverty, which is a bit wordy, but I think it's a really good place to start. So I'm going to read it out, bear with me, and I'll do it slowly. It's from Peter Townsend, who was one of the leading sociologists who started work on poverty in the UK. And he says, individuals, families and groups in the population can be said to be in poverty when they lack the resources to obtain the type of diet, participate in the activities, and have the living conditions and amenities which are customary, or at least widely acknowledged or approved in the societies to which they belong. Their resources are so seriously below those commanded by the average individual or family that they are in effect excluded from ordinary patterns, customs and activities. And that is an important point to make at the beginning, because part of our discussion about food banks has led us to believe that somebody's not in poverty unless they're in absolute destitution. And there is an important distinction. So we wanted to make sure that we start with a very respectful individual focus on poverty, maybe rather than something that's sort of based on statistics, so everyone understands what it is that we're talking about. So we know there's been a lot going on since we were founded in the 60s. You know, poverty has risen dramatically up through the 80s. When we had a government determined to tackle it and a strategy, it went down. We know that poverty responds to public policy. It's not a given. It's not like the weather. We can do something about it. At the moment, it's looking like we are, you know, already we were on course to reach about 5 million kids in poverty by 2021. But of course, now we've had the pandemic as well, which has disrupted that pattern quite significantly. So, you know, all bets are off really as to where we will be in 2 years' time or more. Who's at risk of poverty? Well, we know children in single parent families, 49% are at risk of poverty. Children in families with 3 or more children, 42%. Children in families where someone is disabled, whether that's an adult or a child, 36%. And children in families with an under 5, child poverty is becoming younger, partly as a result of one of the major policies of the 2-child limit, which has penalised families with very young children. But we don't talk about this enough of who else is in poverty. And given the Black Lives Matter focus, we've said, well, actually, the lives of Black children matter, and they're often forgotten in this debate. So we do know that 47%, that's nearly half of Black children living in the UK, are in poverty, compared to 26% on average of white British children. When you look at Bangladeshi families, 60% of children there and 54% in Pakistani families. So child poverty isn't colourblind. And we know that in the 17 local authorities with the highest rate of child poverty, BME children make up almost half the young population. So it really is something to bear in mind when we're thinking about who is in poverty. But behind all of these statistics, I guess, are real kids. So we spent a lot of time explaining what does it mean for a child to be growing up in poverty. And one of the ways in, I usually say to people, it's missing out on the joys of childhood. And people say, well, what do you mean? Well, things we all take for granted, like being able to have your friends around for tea or a sleepover. We've done research with kids who said, you know, I really want to do that, but when they ask me, I have to pretend I'm busy or that I don't want to go because I can't have them back round to my place because we haven't the money to provide the tea or we're living in temporary accommodation. We know that kids are stigmatised at school for not having the right school uniform or wearing a uniform that is shabby or too small. We're doing a lot of work with schools, working with Children North East on our Cost of the School Day and Poverty Proofing in Schools programme at the moment, and helping schools be a bit more aware of how they're planning their services and how they work with kids and parents to be more aware of kids in poverty, and to just plan out a lot of the stigmatising barriers that exist. We know that school lunches are a real problem, because even if you qualify for a free school meal and the qualification criteria are getting tighter and tighter, it's £2.30 a day. And if you've got a canteen service, growing lads are never going to fill themselves up at £2.30 a day. And some of our researchers found kids here or there, you know, they pick what they want to eat and then they get turned back at the till saying, well, your allowance doesn't cover this. And so they see the other kids having the big baguette and they're stuck with a little sandwich and the water and the piece of fruit, knowing that actually that might be the only meal they're getting that day. So it's really stigmatizing and really hurtful for them. Other ways, we've had a lot of look at learning in lockdown recently and what it's meant for kids who don't have those resources. So not being able to work at home because actually you don't even have a dining table you can work at, or you've got a busy family, there's nowhere quiet, you haven't got Wi-Fi, the school sends home online homework, you don't have a device to do it on, or they say print out this sheet, you don't have a printer to print out the worksheet. And all our research found that actually it was the less well-off parents who were having to pay out more for all of these things that were assumed they would have at home, and they didn't. And it's, you know, creating major barriers to equal access to the curriculum. We've done a lot of work with Alder Hey Hospital up in Liverpool around the cost of attending a child's health appointment with the respiratory clinic there if a child has asthma, and worked out the enormous cost to a family of public transport or parking or lost earnings and all the things that go along with that, that we often overlook. And I guess one of the biggest impacts, coming back to our subject of what it means for children, is the humiliation and the anxiety of going with a parent to a food bank for emergency supplies. And the children have spoken to us about this. They've talked about the shame. They can't say where they were to their friends. They don't have the choices that others have, and they find it deeply humiliating. So what do we do about it? Well, we know that public policy works. We've done a lot in the past. We've managed to reduce poverty, not all the way where we hope by 2020, but actually, had we carried on with that previous strategy, we would have probably made it. All the indications are that we were heading in the right direction. We had the biggest falls in child poverty in the OECD between the mid-1990s and 2008. Childhood well-being improved, and we do know that all the extra money that families had actually was spent on fruit, vegetables, children's clothes, books, things that you'd want for your kids. So why is it rising now? Well, you'll be familiar with all of this. I mean, rising costs, rising housing costs, childcare costs, low and stagnating wages, benefit cuts and tax credit cuts. So, 21 billion per year. Coming out. So by 2021, it'll be 40 billion taken out of social security spending. Now that was a prediction before the pandemic response, but this is one of the notable things about the pandemic response is that we haven't seen any measures specifically targeted at helping families with children. So through all of this, pensioners have been protected, yet children are 3 times more likely to be poorer than pensioners. So 70% of the cuts hit families with children, 60% hit working people. And one of the problems of the way that government thinks about poverty is and this was really obvious in the pandemic response, is it sort of divides people into those who work hard for a living, so the workers who were affected by the pandemic, and then the people who were poor, with the implication that they're not working. Now, what we know is 70% of kids growing up in poverty are in a working family. So we're talking about working people here anyway, and it's deeply insulting, I think, for government to carry on as if people aren't, working hard for making their contributions through tax as well that they're making. So we know the cost of a child up to the age of 18 is about 151,000 or 183,000 if you're a lone parent. So bringing up kids is expensive. And extra costs in school holidays can push families from managing into real hardship. So moving on to, I guess, where we are, the most devastating cuts, I suppose, were the 4-year freeze, which actually hit families harder than any of the other cuts. The 2-child limit has been running since April 2017, so now it's impacting on babies and toddlers. And I don't know if people know what that means, but it means if you're in a family getting support from Social Security, even if you're working, you won't get anything for any extra child above 2. Unless you're prepared to go and jump through humiliating hoops to say that child was conceived non-consensually, which is barely used because it's the most humiliating measure I think we've ever seen in Social Security in our time. And one of the biggest issues that's hit families, child benefits going to have lost nearly a quarter of its value this year compared to 2010. So a big problem. So the pandemic and what's been happening, well, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. So, you know, families who are already sort of struggling have sunk deeper into poverty, and millions of households have now had a drop in income. So we had more than 6 million people furloughed. We don't know how many of those will actually retain their jobs, even with the new bonus that's being offered today by the Chancellor to try and keep people in their jobs into the new year. We know that there were 3.1 million new claims for universal credit. Normally it's 10,000 a day, and it's been 146,000 a day. So now up to 5.3 million families on universal credit, which in itself is a device to make cuts. This isn't equivalent to tax credits. The more people move on to universal credit, the more cuts are made. So we think about an extra 200,000 kids are moving into poverty as a result of the pandemic. So what's happening? Well, 2 in 5 families are now in financial difficulties. 1 in 4 people have reported having their household finances affected by COVID. But big differences between household types. So 39% of parents are now reporting having their household finances affected, compared to 22% of non-parents. And that's interesting. And that's probably to do with women's work. And it's probably to do with the lack of childcare to work. And with schools and nurseries closed, has had a major impact on families. So food banks, what's happened? One of the most disturbing stats around what's happened with COVID has been an 81% increase in people needing support from food banks as of the end of March, according to the Trussell Trust, and compared to this time last year, and 122% rise in parcels given to children. And that's really worrying. And one of the things I think that sort of happened throughout communities has been this very human response of, I want to help people in my community. How can I do it? Culturally, we express our friendship, neighborliness by sharing food. So out of this, all of these kind of food charities have sprung up. And some of them are serving a purpose of probably where there are people who genuinely, at least in the beginning, couldn't get to the shops or couldn't get a delivery and really were short of food. But really what we're talking about is, you know, we're in a country where food is plentiful, that we generally don't lack food. But what the issue is that some of us just lack the resources to buy the food that we need. And the same goes with money for rent, fuel, cooking, nappies for children, clothes, household equipment, travel costs, toiletries. And yet, you know, this whole movement around food poverty has sprung up, that food is something sort of particularly bad or particularly difficult for people. And I think it's very difficult and very risky, really. So I would say that the dignity has been one of the first casualties of this pandemic, that more and more people are being offered help in the form of food. And it's really personal for parents, because how you feed your children, what you give them to eat, your cultural concerns, their likes and dislikes, that should be for you as a parent. And yet through all this food poverty charities, there's been a kind of real growth in finger wagging. So people saying, you know, I heard one woman say, well, we have to give them cereal or we have to give them breakfast at school because otherwise their parents will feed them all this terrible rubbish. And it's given people an opportunity to get very judgy and you know, in a way that's really uncomfortable. And I will just kind of end by saying, really, the biggest risk we face here now is that we go the same way as the United States. And there they moved from cash-based social security to food stamps. That was as a result of basically overproduction in agriculture. They had more food and they then thought, how do we solve that problem in supporting farmers and at the same time take away this problem? It came with a lot of judgments around what people were doing to support their families and how they were kind of managing their money and what their needs were. And in simple terms, it said, well, the problem is hunger. The problem is they're not being, you know, getting proper nutrition. So therefore, we won't give them cash, we'll give them food. But with these vouchers and the food stamps came all these restrictions, like the one that I found most horrific was there's a ban on buying any paper products. So you couldn't use a food stamp to buy toilet paper or sanitary towels or any of those other things your family might need, because it was about restricting you to just having food. So I guess my sort of final comment is just let's be really, really careful that we're in danger of walking into a world where food provision by the voluntary sector, by small charities and community groups replaces social security. And we've got to fight for cash-based social security, which I think is under real threat now.
Thank you so much. I mean, you've just taken us through a really harrowing and politically difficult, I was going to say tale, but that's not what it is. This is like the reality of our situation now in the United Kingdom, that a quarter of the value of child benefit has been lost, that there will be, I think I'm right in saying 4.3 million children that are in poverty at the last count, but will increase exponentially because of the coronavirus, the normalisation of FoodBanks. 70% of children in poverty are in working households. We know, and I think the People's Assembly have never shied away from this, that hunger is a deeply political issue. What could be more political than hunger and access to food and the ability to pay for food? And Louisa, I really felt a kind of solidarity and an affinity with what you said about the judgmentalness around parents purchasing. And I've seen even a tweet from a Tory MP talking about the food voucher system and that they've heard about alcohol products being used with those vouchers. I mean, how dare anybody actually use that judgment? We're not judging the richest in society for gold plating their chicken wings or gold plating their private bars or any of the other grotesquely well, it's just grotesque, isn't it? And then to kind of judge the poorest in society for standing outside of Primark, when affordable clothing becomes accessible to you once again, or for spending it on alcohol, I think is grossly unfair. But I really thank you for your contribution. We'll come back to questions to you. We already have some coming in. Two things: please share this, because even if you share this program now, you'll share it to people who will be able to see what Louisa said, Fiona, and what Mary is about to say. Secondly, we do have a People's Assembly meeting in County Durham that you can come to. It'll be virtual, of course, but that is on Monday the 13th and it's at 6 p.m. You'll be very, very welcome. Look out for details of that on the Durham People's Assembly Facebook page, or if you don't want to do it publicly and you want to do it a bit more behind the scenes, please email us at durhampeoplesassembly@gmail.com, and I've been assured that that's been pinned to the chat as well. Next, we have Fiona Nicol. She is, I'm not going to put it any other way, a community hero. She will hate me saying that. She will absolutely hate it. But she is. I muted myself. She runs a food bank in Towlow, and it's an independent food bank. I'm sure she'll talk a little bit about that. It's in the community centre, isn't it, Fiona? And I'm sure you'll give details of that too. But over to you, Fiona, about your experience of running.
Okay. I'll start by saying, the question's being put: have food banks become normalised? And yes, unfortunately they have, but let's be honest, they're not even a stick and plaster on the gaping wound that we've got of austerity. There's anybody who was familiar with Townsend, he's already been mentioned. I was a sociology lecturer, and there was a big difference between urban poverty and rural poverty. We live in a rural community, and one of the factors is transport. So, for instance, families who are eligible for free school meals get these £15 vouchers, and it will cost them £7 of that to actually go to the nearest supermarket. And the myth about alcohol, I actually had one yesterday, because some people actually don't have phones that you can have that app on printed out. Quite clearly says you cannot buy alcohol on them. We have had the UN Rapporteur, Roundtree's Trust, Sutton Trust, who all say quite categorically austerity is the biggest factor resulting in poverty. Now, 50 years ago, approximately, as a very young new social worker, I was sent, I can't really tell you anything about the family, but it was to do with food. Now, the fact that it was such a rarity for the best part of 50 years, I'm giving me age away now, you see, that has stuck in my mind, because it just it didn't happen. So I've been asked to say, what is a food bank? Well, obviously it's essentially providing emergency food for families, but we feel that that in itself isn't sufficient. So we have made sure that we have fundraised, that we have Citizens Advice Bureau in there, we have housing charities in there, and we have provide free tea, coffee, and basically a drop-in service. So anybody who comes in that community centre, which is in Tower Law Community Centre, could be coming in for any one of those things, because there's nothing so undignified in this day and age in 2020, and I certainly never thought I would live to see such a situation, that people have to come and ask for food. We, in our food bank, don't expect people to bring any kind of proof or red vouchers, because again, that diminishes people's, people invariably go, thank you, and we make absolutely categorically, we do not need thanks because it's not our food, and it isn't our food, we've raised it from other places. I've been asked to say who uses food banks. Well, basically think of any category of society, and either families, older people, we've had people from 16 up to 80, all with varying, multiplicity of reasons, transferred on universal credit, a death in the family and the deceased paying the wage earner, 1950s women who have been made unemployed and can't get their pension and expect to look for work, but basically not able to find that. But the overriding reason is haven't got enough money to live on. It's as simple as basic as that. During COVID, we have had a massive increase on demand. I mean, it's just gone exponentially, absolutely through the roof. And we make very sure that because we can't use the community centre for COVID, I should give you a tour of my house. It is like Morrison's. We can't move. We will take out food as and when anybody needs it. We've even had somebody 9:30 one night. That was a bit too. So it's during COVID, as I said, massive increase. And what has caused that massive increase is self-employed who can't tap into this government that, everybody seems to think anybody can get government money. So suddenly unemployed with no income. People who have joint residency of their children, so when they're working, they can actually afford the bedroom tax, because I think that's an issue that's gone well off the boil. We seem to be really on with now. It just doesn't even seem to be mentioned. So if you've got, 2 or 3 kids, you have them half the week, and you've suddenly got 2 bedrooms to pay for, it's physically impossible. And also, people who use food bank are people in work. This idea that the only people who are actually in food poverty or fuel poverty are people who are not in work is, again, another myth. So again, what brings people to the food bank? So I've said, shared residence, self-employed, the school meal vouchers, yes, and people have been very welcome of them, but half the time they don't work. We've had women go to the supermarkets, hand over the app, and they just say, well, sorry, it's not working. So, double humiliation, not working or received. And children at home, when they're not at school, I would like to prove this one day, it's a universal fact, they're hungrier. If you're sitting in the house and they're doing work in the house, they're hungrier. So we deliver it every day, and it's not restricted to the normal day, but we do that in any case. Reasons for increase in food bank. Basically, years of austerity, lack of properly paid work, 0-hour contracts, insecure employment, structural and economic inequality. One of the factors as well, I think, is somebody who was, said my age, who was partially setting up the claimants union, the forerunner of welfare rights. The removal of the social fund. So anybody in crisis, God, I suddenly need a washing machine or, whatever, you could go to the social fund, and that was not a loan, it was not, and that actually supported people in desperate needs. Transfer that to the welfare assistance scheme, and you're talking a much reduced amount of money. You have no choice. I had a family with 5 kids. Now, previous into the social fund, we would have managed to get the cash, and she would have got everything she needed for that house. I said, she said you can have 5 beds and a cooker. I said, but with 5 kids, she needs a washing machine. So I argued on, really knocked the guy on the other end. He went, right, the manager said she can have the washing machine, but she's got to lose 2 of the beds. These are the realities that people are living in, So I'm getting myself And one of the worrying factors for me, going back to the sociological factor, is poverty causes ill health. So straight away, if children are not getting nutrition, families are not getting nutrition, long term, even short term, that increases the ability to stave off illnesses. They're having an inability to do schoolwork because they don't have the technology. So again, they're going to fall back when they go to school. They're going to be behind academically, but also emotionally. They're excluded financially from school activities, and that's one of my big things. And if my daughter's listening, she'll go, yes, we know that, because a number of times you've gone in that school, raising Mary Helen, got their approach to excluding children who don't have money, got it right off. I don't know who's doing it now because they are not there. Going forward, austerity, poverty is a political choice. We need to remove the lack of dignity in not having enough food to feed your families. And I'm now going to go, and apologies for those who are not in the Labour Party, we need a universal basic income. We need free broadband. No good offering laptops. There's people today on the news going around, oh, marvellous, we're giving these children laptops. They haven't got bloody internet. What they're going to do with them? They're absolutely useless. Free broadband, no good offering laptops for this. We need to see the eradication of food banks. Now, this is my very bizarre position on food banks. Sarah Batty and I had a very good discussion on this. Food banks, morally, but reluctantly, correct to support these, and we do, to those in need. However, to me, it's politically abhorrent, absolutely abhorrent. We should not be propping up the welfare state and now allowing government to renege on its duty. The function of government is to ensure all citizens are fully supported, and allowing charities or people like me who aren't a charity to be providing food to families who are in desperate need. As I say, 50 years ago, that one person has stood in my mind because it just didn't happen. You know, we're seeing the eradication of the welfare state system, of welfare benefits. You've already mentioned people with 3 children, and we've had women in that situation, a 3rd child, so you get no money for it. And it comes as a real shock to those women. What do you mean? Well, unless you want to go and humiliate yourself, as I think Louisa said, by saying the child is a product of rape, and I don't know actually, and it's something that we maybe need to research in, has anybody actually gone and done that? So meanwhile, those children will be looked on, you know, and you could see a situation where those children could be, not ostracized, the wrong word, but bringing the family into even deeper poverty. So, you know, I will finish on what I've already said. It's the function of government. We should not be, so yes, we do them, but I want to see a very quick day, and I thought we were going to have that in 2019, but I was very sadly disappointed. How we go forward, I don't know in the next 5 years, because I don't see the situation changing at all. In fact, I see it actually getting a heck of a lot worse, because we're heading for, you know, depression, I would actually think, and we know who are going to be hit the hardest: women, the Northeast, the Northwest. You know, our families are going to be in a deeper, tragic situation of abject poverty. Over and out.
Fiona, honestly, thank you so much, and thank you, you know, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for everything you do and everything that you've done for our communities and in the Northeast. And I mean, you've just set out there. And I don't know if anyone else feels like this actually, and people who are watching feel like this, but there is just so much that we have to fight against. There's so much that our class, our communities, our movement is enduring. And let's just think about that act of running out of food, of there being nothing left in the bank, nothing left in your purse, nothing left in your network, you know, because your family, your friends can't help. And there's nothing. And where do you turn to? You have to turn to not the government, nothing that they've set up, not your employer, that's too embarrassing, or however that person might feel. You have to go to something that has been set up by a voluntary agency. Now, it might seem outrageous to say, but the 2 previous speakers have said it, that is a failure actually of the state. That is the state failing. And not only that, it becomes the safety net of the exploitative employers, because actually they, if you are in work, and that statistic of most people accessing the food banks being in work, or a lot of people accessing food banks are in work, is that actually the minimum rate of hourly pay isn't affording people enough to pay off priority debts, rent, whatever else is a pressure on those people, and to feed themselves. And not only that, as has already been mentioned, the connection, and I know this is something that Mary is very passionate about, the connection between that and public health. So what are you able to put inside your body, and how is that making you feel? How is that contributing to your health in the long term and your child's health? I mean, this is a huge issue. And we start with the idea of food banks, and all of a sudden we're talking about the price of food, we're talking about the government failing, we're talking about poverty wages, we're talking about a system which upholds these conditions of poverty. It's a really, really big issue, and I think Durham's People's Assembly is going to have to do something about it. We can't see our brothers and sisters in our own community go hungry. Absolutely not. The donations, the running of the food banks are an act of solidarity, not an act of charity. We don't pity people who have to use food banks, because this is not about judgment or individual blame. It's an act of solidarity, but we're going to have to do something about all of the factors that lead somebody there. Okay, Mary, I'm so pleased that you have joined us through this whole meeting. I'm so pleased that you're in Parliament. I'm really pleased that that you are safe and well, and that you're joining us here tonight. Mary Foy is the Member of Parliament for the City of Durham. It's over to you.
Thank you, thanks, and thanks for inviting me to speak to you this evening. And it's really great to see the People's Assembly launching in Durham. And obviously it's a pleasure to see you again, Laura. I first met Laura through Show Racism the Red Card, and we've also campaigned on many occasions over the last 10 years or so, whether it's been on a union platform or the Corbyn leadership campaign, and I'm glad and obviously not surprised that you're still fighting the good cause and speaking out there. I think this issue tonight that we're discussing is incredibly important, and it's something that we can't ignore as we go about our daily lives. But it's important to remember as we talk about the politics behind food banks, that every food parcel that's sent, every statistic is someone's life, and it's someone's story, and it's really important to remember that. And yet there is a stigma, and people are feeling anxiety and shame, but we have to remember that this is somebody's story, and nobody can be judgmental about it at all. And food banks have become such a normal part of our lives, for all of us, whether we're just members of the community, councillors, MPs. It's becoming harder to remember a time when they didn't exist, but they actually are a fairly new development. And 3/4 of all independent food banks started operating in the last 9 years, and 1/3 of those food banks opened in 2012-13 at the height of Tory austerity, which, no coincidence there then, but we really can't allow them to become normal. So in 2018-19, the Trust Food Banks distributed over 1.5 million 3-day emergency parcels, and that was an 18.8% increase on the previous year. And around 1/3 of these went to children, which is, absolutely scandalous. And in the 6 months between April and September last year, they provided 823,000 emergency food parcels to people in crisis, which is a 23% increase on the same period in 2018. And in the Northeast, during that same 6 months, there was 42,000 3-day parcels were given out. And we've already heard that we haven't seen how the COVID-19 is going to impact on these figures. But the Trussell Trust have reported that it's their busiest period ever. I think we've also got to remember that when we talk about these statistics, they're really only scratching the surface. These food banks have been organised by the Trussell Trust, which is about 1,200 of those food banks. But there's also thought to be about 800 food banks operating through other organisations and independent networks. But there's also hundreds of unofficial operations happening too. There's meal providers in all of our communities, and there's food recycling groups, the social supermarkets, breakfast clubs, and your holiday hunger clubs in school. It's outrageous. The Durham Food Bank is operated by the Trussell Trust, and that opened in 2011. And in that time, the number of food parcels that have been sent out has been steadily increasing. In 2018-19, they distributed 89,000 three-day food parcels to the people of Durham. And they also provide other services like money and debt advice, and the signpost people to other services, including the MP's office. And when we see people in the office, the people who come to us are normally at the end of the process. So we're often talking about really desperate people, and the food bank has been an absolute lifeline for them. And what we've seen, I think, under lockdown, and what everybody will have seen, I'm sure, is that that blossoming of community spirit. There's been no doubt about it at all. I've seen local party activists collecting donations for the food banks and for key workers. There's been partnerships between local supermarkets and community groups. That we've had local restaurants doing takeaways for the NHS staff, and there's dozens of local projects around in the community who are really supporting and feeding vulnerable people and those people who are shielding in their communities. And it's these initiatives that have been happening over the years, but these initiatives really make me very proud to represent the city of Durham, and it's really heartwarming to see people coming together and working together under such adversity. But I think there's also another aspect to all of this, and whilst I can't praise those people enough who dedicate their lives in supporting people in distress, because we've seen that they are the backbone to society at the minute. I think it's also probably quite a realistic assessment to say that there'll always be poor amongst us. But as socialists, I think we know that poverty isn't inevitable, and charity shouldn't be a necessity. It shouldn't be there. I think, and Rebecca West, a famous author, she called charity an ugly trick, and she said, "It's a virtue grown by the rich on the graves of the poor, and unless it's accompanied by sincere revolt against the present social system, it's a cheap moral swagger." And I think that's what we've got to continually remind our communities as people who believe in a different world and in an alternative economic model where food banks shouldn't be necessary. And I think that's one of the reasons why we also didn't swallow the whole narrative about the big society that came in with David Cameron, because we knew that was a trick. It was getting people to do the work of the state for free, whilst they underfunded outsourced care and health services and local government. So if we do need food banks, and we clearly do, sadly, we should also make sure that we look at the underlying reasons that why they're there, and use our voices and our positions to make sure that people know the causes and who's responsible for this, and how do we solve these problems. The Trussell Trust's research on the people that use food banks tells us the real story. We've already heard from Fiona. some of those real stories. But 2/3 of people had experienced problems with the benefit system. In 43% of cases, benefits was the main reason for the referral. And over 3/4 of people using food banks had rent arrears. And I know from since universal credit was brought in, the changes to how housing benefits being paid to people has had a huge impact on the number of the rent arrears for people. And 40% of people have been repaying just debts, and a lot of these debts are just debts for the cost of living, everyday living. And the majority, and a lot of those debts are paying back to the DWP. 7 out of 10 respondents said that they'd suffered at least one challenging life experience, whether that was eviction, divorce, or the loss of a job. And 75% reported at least one health issue, and 54% suffered a mental health problem. And, you know, I know whether or not you suffered a mental health problem before, then the fact that you're having to use a food bank and claiming benefits only exacerbates a person's mental health. So we are going to see a huge rise, or already seeing a huge rise in mental health issues. And we've just heard from Fiona, obviously physical health as well, and people, you know, children who are going to grow up unhealthy, both physically and mentally. And we also know that kids don't learn properly when they're hungry. So it's going to impact on them for the rest of their life. So really, and summing up, we've seen that the causes are evident there. It's about the removal of the government safety net, it's about austerity, about low wages, and all the food banks, charities, homeless shelters in the world are just a sticking plaster over those much bigger societal problems. And I think if we want to fix things in the long term, it's not enough just to run food banks and charities, even though they are extremely worthy causes. But we have to be like Rebecca West and revolt against the current system and speak out if we really are to get any real change. Thank you.
Thank you. Honestly, thank you so much, Mary. And I think that is like the point of the People's Assembly as well, that whilst we are on the one hand, many of the activists involved in the People's Assembly are part of mutual aid groups or are running food banks, that we have to match it, as you said, with real action around fighting against the causes or the drivers towards food banks. So one of those has to be the exploitative practices, the erosion of terms and conditions. We can see that already in this coronavirus crisis, that many workers are being laid off, and then when demand potentially picks up, probably rehired on worse terms and conditions and less pay. And we know what effect that will have. In the People's Assembly in County Durham, we will be organising and make sure that we are in defence of those workers against any attacks on workers' rights and in solidarity with those people. I'm just going to come with a few of the comments and put them back on you. We have a little bit of time left. And just to say as well that we have put a link in the chat on Facebook to a list of food banks in County Durham, because we know that there might be some people listening tonight who wouldn't know where to start but are in a difficult situation. Angela says, poverty disproportionately affects women, and under this misogynistic government, women's rights are being eroded. We must stand together to fight this. Solidarity. I mean, I really agree with that, but I wonder if any of you could say a little bit about the particular impact that austerity potentially layered on top of that coronavirus is having on women. Louisa, could I start with you?
Where to start, really, because you know, so much of our social security system anyway is discriminates against women all the way through. So you get to something like the benefit cap has a disproportionate effect on lone parents, the majority of whom are women. Women struggle to work, often because there isn't affordable basic childcare or of good enough quality locally for them to use, giving them the hours and flexibility that they need. women have the majority responsibility for looking after children. Universal credit and its whole design is based on this 1950s idea of family life, where you got, you know, kind of a husband who you know is the earner, and a wife who's looking after the kids. So all the money goes to one person in the household, very often the man, and women miss out enormously through that system. You could find 100 different points in the way that that women are discriminated against, and when it comes to, you know, women and children particularly, then you see things like the 2-child limit, which is one of the most offensive policies, based on the idea that you know, if you can't foresee the future and you haven't enough money guaranteed for 18 years, you should not be, you know, having children. Your fertility should be checked in order to make sure that you're not a drain on the public purse. It's you know, it's enormously offensive.
It is, yeah. and I've been in Parliament when that rule has been discussed, and it's so flippantly battered away by the government. And I think this is a point for anybody watching who is in County Durham or elsewhere, that our change often comes through the pressure that we exert and the noise that we make about a particular issue. So we've already heard about the 2-child limit, we've heard about the bedroom tax, which Fiona quite rightly said has kind of gone away. We need to reignite these campaigns. We need to make a noise about this, because I know that many of the people subject to these rules are running out of energy. You know, it's hard to fight for yourself when you're in that position, but obviously anyone who is also experiencing that would be welcome in our campaign. So let me ask you this, Fiona, because I know you've done organising around well, women's solidarity and things that impact women disproportionately. Do you think we need specific women's campaigns as we emerge from coronavirus?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you look around the world, and, you know, in any society, women are the poorest. That's not just to this country, but, you know, if we're looking at the situation that we have here, invariably women are in less secure employment. They're the lowest paid, and then when what we've got going on now, will be expected to do the childcare even if they're in a relationship. But obviously, the majority of lone parents are realistically women. So yes, it's going to, anything that's happening now and that's going to come in the future is going to have that impact on women. And certainly, I think that is a campaign that we really need to get up and running, and show solidarity with those women who are struggling, you know, on their own with children. And certainly going away from this, because it's really triggered in me have a weird way, I'm actually going to get in touch with the Victims Commissioner to actually see if she can research this thing, how many families have been affected by the 3 children, well, the 2 children rule, because that is something, you know, sometimes you need a hook to kind of take things forward. And I think that sounds, I'm not being, you know, but certainly I think we need to do some awareness campaigning around women's issues. You know, and I'm just going to go off on a total tangent. We've had this last 2 years, young girls not being able to go to school because their families can't afford sanitary protection. I mean, it's absolutely, you know, unbelievable. Obviously, you know, and then the government said it would take away from the Red Box campaign that we were running. Yeah, and they've given £17 to each school. I mean, like, come on, you know, so that will be going on. And I think that's something, again, that we'll probably have to spark up. You know, we cannot have women and children women and young girls not being able to go around the normal activities because they can't afford a sanitary protection.
What do you think, Mary?
Yeah, I obviously agree with what's been said, and I think you know, we've seen now during this crisis that most of our key workers are women, and it's those workers in those sectors that we rely on to live. You know, whether it's the care workers or in the shop workers, you know, our NHS staff, they're all the key workers who, in the main, are underpaid, and they're underpaid, and they're the least respected in society. And I think there's a real push now for us to be able to make the changes now. When we're talking about better jobs, we need to make those jobs decent jobs that pay equal wages. And it's really important that we work ever closely with the trade unions now around sectoral collective bargaining, because we have to now push the wages of care workers up. It's just outrageous that they're paid such a poor wage for such an important job. And if you know, if we had better wages, and we've heard that if we had decent wages for people to live on, men and women, then we wouldn't need food bank. We wouldn't be needing food banks and seeing kids going hungry. So we have got a lot to do, but it's there for the grabbing, really. I think for the taking at the minute.
It certainly is. And if you are a woman in County Durham and you feel the same, you feel like a lot of these societal issues are impacting more on your friends, on you, please get involved. Like, we would want to work with you on a campaign like this. I'm just going to read out.
Can I just say one thing? You know, one of the things that again has been hidden throughout of all this moves, you know, with a tiny little bit of the news, the domestic homicides have gone up massively because of abuse has gone up, but also domestic homicides, and they're not giving anything like the publicity that they should be.
It's absolutely unbelievable at the time where, you know, refuges for the last decade have seen their funding become, you know, more and more insecure. Jennifer talked about, and this is an interesting one, probably for all of you actually, the things that they've been given to eat from the food bank. Yeah. So, you know, and things that people had like donated. So, and I certainly saw this in working around refugee issues, that there are inappropriate donations. She said, "What do I do with truffle mayonnaise? We had no fresh veg, but a tin of beans the size of my head." I mean, I know it's like, I know she's obviously been flippant but serious as well. You know, there probably are some important things that we need to say right now about inappropriate donations. So Louisa, come on, you're kind of laughing in a familiar way. Come on.
Oh, that's the dignity issue, isn't it? It's the idea that beggars can't be choosers. So I remember I grew up in rural Ireland as a kid. We'd have these harvest festivals, and they would say, you know, every kid had to bring something, and we had nothing to bring but a manky can of, I think it was sort of beef and kidney soup or something at the back of the cupboard. And we sort of pitied anyone poorer than us who had to have that. Because, you know, we have to think about dignity here, and that isn't getting preachy about nutritional standards and what people should be eating, but decent, you know, if we're supporting people decent food that people can, you know, make a decent meal for their family with, and not, you know, one family said to me that, you know, they never want to see pasta again in their life because they've just been living off a bag of pasta and 101 creative things to do with a stock cube and a bag of pasta. So we do have to think about that. And I mean, on the campaigning point, I know we don't have much time, so come on our website, join us as a supporter. We're campaigning against the 2-child limit and all of these other issues. So, you know, we need people to come and support us and take the issues out there. Please do.
Another campaign that's been brought to my attention is the Raise Child Benefit campaign, and there's a hashtag for that, hashtag Raise Child Benefit. I mean, there's a really quick and easy way. The system's already set up. They're suggesting £50 a week, so it'd be great if people could support that campaign. I think it sounds like a great idea. I don't know about you, Louisa.
Oh, we're leading one of our own on this one. Yeah, it's the obvious. I mean, if the Chancellor had wanted to get money to families quickly at the beginning of the pandemic, we said, forget vouchers for school meals, just send them the money directly through child benefit. It reaches them, it gives them freedom, it gives them dignity to buy what they need for their kids, whether that's food or, you know, data connection or whatever. And we did some calculations, and actually paying every family £10 extra on child benefit is more effective than the extra £20 a week they put on universal credit in reducing child poverty. So, you know, it's the way to go for effectiveness, especially now when people are so insecure in their work.
I know that that one of the, and this is about the dignity point, but I just want to say it because they've been kind enough to share this experience with us, that they don't get a choice over what's sent out sometimes. They've ate so much processed food in lockdown, and other people have talked about conditions that they've got and how important it is to get that fresh produce because of the that this person, Anuska, talked about a thyroid issue. These are really important issues that affect people's health and lives. I know we're running out of time, so I want to come back to you all right now, kind of based on a comment from Angela. She said, as a social worker of 24 years, I've seen all sorts of family support, including access to emergency funds, being decimated. The cuts by the Tory government have been nothing short of murderous. I mean, Angela's putting it in those terms, and I can see nodding. I just want to hear from you two things, really. So, one thing, because we are short on time, and I want this to be uplifting. You know, people, you know, it's heavy on the soul, all of this, isn't it? Because we know people in these circumstances. This is not hypothetical for people on this call, and people watching. So what are you saying to people now in County Durham? What should they be fighting for? What hope should they take? Just give us your final thoughts, if you would. And I'll go in the same order, if you don't mind. Louisa, you first, then Fiona and Mary.
Well, I suppose the uplifting point is we can build better. It doesn't have to be this way. So, you know, campaign, support your MPs if they're arguing on these issues. If you have an MP who's not engaged on these issues, get them engaged. There's huge amounts of evidence out there, and it just needs the right number of people in Parliament to act. And that's up to us to make it an issue on their agenda, which we'll be working hard at. So come join CPAG in doing that.
Thanks so much, Fiona.
Well, pretty much on the same thing that Louisa said. You know, we can't together, singularly we can't make a difference, but together, if we, you know, fight together, we can make a better world, and we need to make that better world for, you know, for our children, our grandchildren, and to show people that, you know, life can be different. And together, campaigning and putting pressure on the government, on MPs, to actually make sure that, you know, next year, the next year after, the children are not going hungry in our society.
And the final word to you, Mary. Thanks, Fiona.
Thanks. Well, yeah, exactly what's been said, but I think we always have to listen to people's stories and their experiences and be the ones who are raising their voices. And I can raise their voice in Parliament. We always must stand in solidarity with them. And there's absolutely no shame in believing in utopia. That's my final word.
I mean, I would completely agree with that. I think a different world is perfectly possible. Why would we limit our expectations about what we can achieve? And certainly in County Durham, let me just say this as kind of a final plea to people who have been watching this. If you are in County Durham, we do this because we love County Durham, not because we feel down about our area or the people that live here. We love it here and we want it to be better. We want there to be no person in County Durham who is hungry or in poverty, and that takes, yes, individual actions, but it takes systemic change. And to get that system change, to get those political differences and a different approach to how people see work and the system and the welfare state, it takes people to get organised. So you would be very welcome if you want a different system, if you want a different, more positive, more hopeful County Durham. Join us on Monday at 6 p.m. Like the Durham People's Assembly Facebook page, check out the Child Benefit Campaign, check out CPAG, and we can make the difference. Just thank you so much for watching, and share this now because it'll still be seen. Thank you.